Hey guys, I'm MG, and today I'll be looking at The Karate Kid Part 3, which is a 1989 American martial arts drama film that was directed by returning director John G. Avildsen and written by returning writer Robert Mark Kamen. However, we're not here to name returnees, we're here to review, so why don't we do that right now? This film received pretty harsh backlash over the years, even the director and Ralph Macchio hated it. But I think this movie gets too much criticism. Like, yes, it's not necessarily good, but it does have some highs that make it a decent enough film. Obviously, it has a bunch of issues. Like, it does rehash elements of the previous two films, with a story about fighting in the same tournament, featuring similar scenes from the original, like the training montage. And the setting is the exact same, with barely any interesting new locations, with some weaker production design that kind of does stick out. Especially compared to Part 2, which has a bunch of excellent production design. And speaking of Part 2, I don't like how it's mostly ignored. They definitely don't erase it, but if you completely skip the second film to a third, then you basically forget that Part 2 exists, because of how little it's involved in anything happening in the film. And I really hate that because it was really good, despite its problems. The original characters are also weaker in this film, and the new ones aren't that special. Daniel LaRusso and Mr Miyagi are still as likable as ever, and they do have decent chemistry, but it's nowhere close to the same level as the first two films, with some scenes that fell flat emotionally, like when Miyagi refuses to train him. I don't feel anything after that scene. But that's not the case entirely, since they do have strong moments, like when Miyagi is comforting Daniel, or when Miyagi sings. That's literally one of the funniest moments in the whole franchise. Alongside the scene where Mr. Miyagi tries to teach Daniel how to broom. Like, that's classic from Mr. Miyagi. And Ralph Macchio and Morita were still really good in their acting. And they definitely don't deserve a nomination for Worst Actor. Like, that's just too harsh. Jessica was really boring, and her scenes with Daniel are completely pointless, since the character ends up moving away before the climax. But their final scene was pretty nice, and I will say that Robin Lively was pretty solid, but I think she was miscast and sounds a bit too young for her age. That's not the actress's fault, and the actress was good, but it would have been better if they didn't have a girl for Daniel, as she serves no purpose to the plot. Or if you needed a girl, then no offense Lively, but cast another actress, because I think her role was heavily miscast. And now we get to the villains, who are better than Sato and Chosen, but are still not that interesting. Terry Silver was a decent enough villain, who has a handful of intimidating moments, with energetic acting from Thomas Ian Griffith. He was overacting a little bit, but overall, he was pretty effective, and his character isn't half bad. Sure, his plan is kind of luck-based, which I'm not a huge fan of, and I kind of think that him pretending to be a good guy doesn't fully work, because he gets quite strict in the training scenes, and also, how does he fit into a sink? Like, I'm genuinely curious. How does a very tall man fit in a tiny sink? I just can't wrap my head around it. But all in all, a very fine villain. John Kreese doesn't really work for me as he used to in the original. Martin Kove was really solid, but the character has a lot of problems, with the biggest one being how we forgot he's in a story. Now obviously he shouldn't have played a huge role, but he's just absent for too much of a film, that when you see him in a dojo, you're like, oh, he exists? Okay. I also think it's out of character for him to say to Terry that he doesn't need to take revenge on Daniel and Mr. Miyagi. Like, bro, he should be angrier than ever based on how he acted in the previous films. Instead, he just lets it go, which is just really wrong, especially for his character. And the last villain, Mike, was really boring. Sean Kanana was wonderful in his acting, and he proved to be a worthy opponent to Daniel, but Mike's motivation for money is just too shallow. The character himself is really one note, and I see him more as a rageful beast, rather than a friendly bad boy. But at least he's better than Chosen, so there's that. So yeah, I definitely understand the hate, especially compared to the other films. But even then, this still has some good aspects. Like, the music by Bill Conti is greater than ever, and feels more energetic, because of how energetic the action scenes were. And speaking of the action, those scenes were really entertaining as well. The fight in the shop was really cool, the cliff scene is one of the best moments in the entire franchise, the attack on LaRusso was decent, the fight in the dojo was really cool, and the final battle was quite enticing, despite it being a rehash of the first film's climax. I also like how Daniel's friendship with Mr. Miyagi is also tested. Yes, it boils down to the same story as the first, but it was an interesting idea that I think this movie presents fairly well, although it could have been fleshed out a lot more. But it's still interesting enough as it is, so I can respect that. The cinematography is inferior to the first two, but it has a lot of effective shots that I really enjoyed, and it kind of lives up to some of the most beautiful shots in this franchise. So overall, this film was decent enough, and while I understand the hate, I think there's too much hate that this film is experiencing. So if you're a fan of this franchise, then I would say it's worth watching at least once. 6.3 out of 10. Goodbye everyone, and thank you for watching. Bye.